It's Wednesday, September 29th, 2021, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio in the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm here with my colleagues, Ron Kelley and Earnest Perry. On our program this week, the death of Gabby Petito and the search for her fiance. It sucked the wind out of the last week's news cycle. We're going to talk about missing white woman syndrome and the harm such overblown coverage causes in communities of color.
I'm Lester Holt. Tonight, on the 30th season premiere of Dateline.
Maybe not so ironically, this week also marks the 30th anniversary of NBC's Dateline program. We'll talk about why the show's mainstays says that Petito case will likely never make it onto that show. And The View last Friday was must-see TV for how the producers and hosts responded live on air to what we now know to be false positives for COVID, only seconds before Vice President Kamala Harris was to appear on that show. There's a lot more that hopefully we'll get to before our half hour is up today, but we're going to start with Monday's guilty verdict against R&B singer R. Kelley, which I must say, no relation to Ron Kelley sitting next to me on the right. This came after decades of allegations and a weeks-long trial in a federal courtroom in New York. The jury found Kelley guilty on charges of sexual exploitation of a child, bribery, racketeering, and sex trafficking. He's facing anywhere between 10 years to life on these counts. He's still also facing federal charges in the Illinois federal district courts as well. For his victims and some of the reporters who've been drawing attention to his actions, this brings the beginning part of closure of more than 25 years of abuse and on some parts of reporting.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. This is sort of a beginning of the culmination of what a lot of his victims and their supporters have been pushing for a long time. And it really wouldn't have come about had it not been for women in power in the media being able to expose a lot of what was going on there with R. Kelley. And as you said, this has been going on for 25 years, maybe even longer.
Jim DeRogatis broke the first story 21 years ago. He was writing about that in the New Yorker piece.
But I mean, that came out in the New Yorker piece back then, and it's taken this long to happen because the stories of these women didn't resonate until it made it onto Surviving R. Kelley and Lifetime, and then the subsequent investigations that came after that.
And that was 2019 that aired. And you had kind of mentioned as we were talking before the program, Earnest, that in some regards, Lifetime was on a lifeline at that point, that series also brought new life to that network as well as the attention came around this. I don't know if my view on this was skewed, Ron, having worked in Chicago as long as I did, knowing that first tape of some of the behaviors and some of what was happening there was sent to the Chicago Sun-Times so early. That was happening early 2000s. And the entire time I remember being in a newsroom, every month there would be R. Kelley had another appearance. So to me, this has been going on for so long. Nationally, is that something that had that same kind of resonance?
So.
Like, take me out of my Chicago bias.
I think so. I think it's been going on for a long time, and I think really a lot of journalists kind of ignored it or just didn't pay enough attention to it for some of the reasons that Earnest talked about, because they were Black and brown women. Because I think a lot of journalists knew about the rumors of what he was doing, about his behavior, but maybe they just didn't take it serious enough. And, because he's a music artist, I think he was covered a lot by the music publications and music critics, and they, or trying to sell their magazines, maybe didn't take it as serious enough because he was popular. His music was popular. And
He had the song from Space Jam.
yeah, exactly. And so
I mean, there was crossover there
yeah,
too.
and
It
so
wasn't just the R&B.
they would still continue to cover
Yeah.
him, but maybe they didn't take the charges as serious enough. But maybe they should have, but just didn't want to go that deep into some of the allegations or some of the rumors that they were hearing about.
Talk for a second about the impact, again, going back to that documentary, and then even one step further, the fact that those filmmakers were women of color. Gayle King is a black woman, having her exclusive interview with him that really gave people insight into just how out of control the guy was.
Yeah, I mean, and their ability to be able to take that and use the documentary format as a way to expose that, and then be able to find an outlet that would resonate and be able to sort of expose this, sort of actually moved law enforcement and the criminal justice system to begin to take this a lot more seriously and actually have evidence. It provided a voice for the women who have been out there saying, look, this happened to me, and no one is paying attention to it. And so that I think is what really sort of helped in exposing a lot of this.
Yeah, so this was really a win for I think the women who were victimized by him, that this has finally taken place.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
One of the points that Jim Derogatis drove home in his piece that's in the New Yorker that you can read on our Links blog is about the need for healing for the girls, now women, who R. Kelley hurt, and how his crimes were especially harmful to black girls in the black community. And in some ways that leads in really well to our next topic, the overblown coverage, and now the investigation into the death of Gabby Petito. Petito, a pretty, white, blonde woman known across the internet as a travel vlogger and influencer, went missing during a van trip with her fiance, and he's now the subject of a nationwide manhunt with a warrant out for his arrest, having used a debit card not in his name. How do we know so much about what's going on in her case, but not in the case of tens of thousands of black and brown and indigenous women? Well, take a listen to this clip from 2004 in which CNN's Suzanne Malveaux and the late Gwen Ifill hit the nail on the head.
I think at the time when 94 in Rwanda, we were looking at, Nancy Kerrigan and Tanya Harding and Wayne Bobbitt. Everybody knows what happened to Bobbitt.
I call it the missing white woman syndrome. If there's a missing white woman, we're going to cover that every day.
It's true.
It's true, and you could kind of see there if you were watching the video how Gwen Ifill just kind of does like the hand wave and the shake there. Missing white women syndrome, if I think about it, just as I was putting the show together yesterday, I tried to think of the names off the top of my head. You've got Stacey Peterson, you've got Lacey Peterson, you've got Chandra Levy, you've got Gabby Petito. We could come up with dozens more. I also tried to think about who are some of the black and brown and indigenous women that I could name right off the top of my head. And the only ones I could come up with were Diamond and Tiondra Bradley, who were kidnapped as children and never found. The news media has been complicit in this.
Absolutely. I mean, this is Gwen Ifill was talking about this in 2004.
17 years ago.
17 years ago, and she was talking about it from a historic perspective. Okay, so this is nothing new. I mean, back when I was in the business, it was the same sort of thing. If there was a white woman and she was missing, especially if she was from a middle class or an affluent family that had the ability to be able to access the media operations, I mean, they got the coverage. And this is another example of, even in the social media internet age, when everything is out there on social media, it still resonates.
Do you think it makes it even worse today in the social media and internet age than it was even previously?
I wouldn't necessarily say it makes it worse.
Okay.
I think what it does is that it shows that even in a new medium, mm-hmm. you still have the same principles still apply. The same sort of journalistic practices still remain. It's just a new way of putting it out there that connects with audiences and resonates, because really what this is about is the fact that these stories get the audience. It gets clicks, it gets views, it gets eyeballs on the screen. I mean, it plays into all of that.
And so we're playing into this stereotype narrative that if it's a missing white woman from a middle class family, that she's coming from a safe environment. So it's kind of this shocking thing that if she goes missing, that it's surprising. But if it's a black or brown woman goes missing, she doesn't come from a safe environment, so it's not as surprising, so probably doesn't get as much coverage. So we're kind of playing into that kind of stereotype narrative, and I think that's why a lot of times we don't get to see as much coverage of missing black and brown women in the news. And I think also we're playing into the narrative, well, part of the problem is too, when you look at our newsrooms and the makeup of who's making the decisions of coverage, it's still disproportionately white. And so a lot of those coverage decisions are being made by white managers and news directors and editors. And so I think we've got to rethink how we cover these kind of stories.
And even when the editors in the newsrooms know what they're doing, the way the story is driven and the fact that it does gets the audience that it gets almost forces you into doing it because your competitors are doing it, and
Exactly.
you don't want to give up that market share on a story like that.
Because if they're doing it, we need to.
If they're doing it,
Ron,
we
you
need to.
raised an excellent point too about representation within management ranks and newsrooms. And I want to talk for a minute about something that's happening right now in San Francisco in the Bay Area, where one of the longest tenured anchors at a station there has been suspended indefinitely after having an argument with his news director about the amount of coverage being given to this case. And Frank Somerville is a white man. He is married to a black woman. They have an adopted daughter who is black. And he wanted to kind of include a statement or kind of let's put this in perspective at the end of one of their stories about Gabby Petito. It was 46 seconds long. He wrote the statement he wanted to make. And this turned into a fight in the newsroom because his news director, a white woman, said, no, we're not doing this. And he stood for what he believed to be right.
And remind me what the statement was.
This was, in fact, giving in
Okay.
to missing white
Okay.
woman
Yeah,
syndrome,
okay.
that
Yeah.
there are these tens of thousands of black and indigenous women
Yes, yeah.
who are missing, who aren't getting the attention
Yeah,
and the
exactly.
coverage, and in some cases the support of law enforcement as well to bring them home or to investigate what happened to him. Or to them, that he wanted to truly put this into context and was rebuked and possibly have lost his job over it.
Yeah, so that's what you run into when you have those situations where you have a disproportionately number of managers making decisions that are white. You have those situations that happen. And that's why it's important to have more of a diverse newsroom so that he could have maybe someone else to help back him up to say, we need to really look at this and think about how we are covering the story and bring up those facts. I mean, I think the New York Times had an interesting point about when they were covering the Petito case that like the University of Wyoming found like there have 710 indigenous people gone missing between 2011 and 2020. And I'm sure not very many of those got any news coverage during that time.
Right. I mean, the other thing, too, that bothers me about the San Francisco incident is that, you know, he was trying to basically provide some sort of balance. And his news editor didn't give him the opportunity to be able to do that. So, you know, he basically took a stand.
Yeah.
And I think that was courageous on his part.
Exactly.
So Dateline's Josh Mankiewicz told Tom Jones of the Poynter Institute this week that it's not too likely that you're going to find the Gabby Petito case covered on Dateline, that it's too cut and dry, or at least appears to be right now, for that series to pick it up. Ironically, this is the 30th anniversary of Dateline on NBC. It has gripped this nation with its true crime stories.
Yeah, it's addictive to watch. I mean, you know, then sometimes, I mean, even when I find myself watching it, you know, you have to stay with it until the end, and then when I get to the end, having been in this business for as long, I'm going like, wait a minute, you know, that story could have actually been told in about 20 minutes maybe.
So how much of that is about the storytelling? How are they doing that?
That's it. It's the storytelling. It's the ability to be able to get enough information about the story and to pull enough together to move the audience from segment to segment. So that when the commercial starts, you can't sort of like say, okay, I'm going to turn to something else because you want to know what the next piece is going to be.
It's like a dramatization of a crime story to me. Yeah, I mean, actually, I don't like it, and so I don't watch it.
I did for a while.
Yeah,
30 years is a long time.
Yeah, so I actually quit watching them, and because I don't like it, because the style of it actually. So.
Yeah, but to be on for 30 years is the ability to be able to craft a narrative that pulls the viewer in and keeps them there. And it's episodic. It's almost like watching Law and Order or any of the thematic drama shows. What they've done is they've taken that true crime and they put it into that format, and it has worked. I mean, Law and Order was on for a long time.
Still is.
It
if
still
you watch
is.
SVU.
Yeah.
The public like mysteries. We like mysteries. And
Yeah.
so this is like a mystery on solving a mystery, and that's kind of how they've done it.
And they find these cases. I mean, those cases are out there.
Yeah.
And they usually are covered by local media. And so what they're doing is taking a local media story and bringing it national through these
I can think of at
crime
least 2
narratives.
Columbia cases that have shown up on
the show.
Dateline.
On Dateline, you Dateline. I forget what the 2020. All of those types of shows. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so I want to let our audience in on a few secrets, and fact of the matter is we even have one from our show here today. If you're listening to this program on KBIA, spoiler alert, it's not live. We record it earlier in the day. Today, we're recording just before lunchtime, and you may be watching live on either Facebook or YouTube while we record. Our show is what we in the business call live to tape. We produce it as the full half hour as it is, and once we start, we don't stop, no matter what happens. We're live, but we're not. So now that I've made that clear as mud, I want to talk about what happened Friday on The View, which is live. And I mean live, like for real live. And if you were watching, you saw this right before they were supposed to introduce a highly promoted interview with Vice President Kamala Harris.
Need the two of you to step off for a second.
Okay. Anna and
we're going to bring
Sonny
you back later.
have to leave.
Yeah. Yes.
And we'll tell you why.
More information later. It's a tease.
We'll tell you why in a couple of minutes. So shall I introduce the Vice President?
Yes.
Okay. So, Vice President... No.
Nope.
Okay. Shall we dance? Let's do a tap dance. Since this is going to be a major news story any minute now.
Yeah.
What happened is that Sonny and Anna both apparently tested positive for COVID. No matter how hard we try, these things happen. They probably have a breakthrough case, and they'll be okay, I'm sure, because they're both vaccinated up the wazoo.
Vaccinated up the wazoo. I don't know what that means, but we're going to say that was ad-libbing. So my mom was watching this as it happened, and she kept texting me throughout the hour using language to describe it that usually comes out of my mouth and not hers. When I got home, I watched the full hour, and in so many ways, my heart broke. It broke for Sonny and for Anna. It broke for Joy Behar and Sarah Haynes, for the producer. Earnest, we've been doing this show long enough that we have a sense of how to roll with things, right? Like, here's a little secret we weren't telling anyone yet. I didn't have a teleprompter for this show until 4 minutes ago. So we were dealing with our own technical issues and trying to make this all work on the fly. It's really hard in some cases where you can't stop and you can't start over. To keep going.
To keep going.
Exactly.
You know, you're figuring it out in real time. You know, it's like, let's go with it until we can get back into the groove.
Yeah.
And just watching that, I'm thinking, wow, you got the Vice President of the United States who's ready to come on the air.
And she was going to make a pretty big announcement about internet and infrastructure.
Right.
Yeah.
And you have someone screaming in your earpiece, which you're the only one on this show that actually has one. And they're basically saying we have to figure out a way to stop this because you two have just tested positive. Or we just been informed that you two have tested positive.
Which
for COVID.
we now know that they didn't have COVID.
Right. I mean, that's. I mean, I don't even. As a producer, I don't even know how do you keep rolling with that.
So I will tell you, and Ron, we're going to talk a minute about what your experiences have been on the air. I'm going to tell you what one of mine was as a producer. We had a complete meltdown live on the air. We had a technical meltdown. And at the time, Ben Bradley, who is a grad of our program, now works for WGN TV, he was anchoring. And he was really complaining before the show that we were having a guest on and he wasn't happy with what they were talking about and the guest wasn't happy with him. It was this terrible situation. And I'm like, just get through the segment, it's fine. It was about exercise. And this was when like those exercise bands were really popular. Well, we had a technical meltdown and our master control couldn't go to a commercial break at the end of the segment. And I just kept getting into Ben's earpiece like the one that I wear and saying, keep going. And he went, huh? And I kind of looked in the camera. I'm like, get on the floor and start doing sit-ups and you start doing calisthenics. I'm like, for 4 or 5 minutes, he was exercising. Ron, you had talked too about how you run into some situations on the air too, where like that live TV thing just came to eat you right up.
Exactly. I think I can remember one time being on a live shot, doing a live report for one of the newscasts when I was a reporter. And I think I was talking about a story and I got confused about some of the facts or some of the things I was talking about. And then I just kind of lost my place, and I think I just started babbling, and I think they just had to cut me off because it's like, I'm not sure what I was even talking about, you know? So you have those situations where it's like, you feel like you have to say something to keep going, but you're not sure what you're saying. And so it's like, I think he doesn't know what he's talking about. Let's just cut him off. It's like, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the thing about, and we see it every day in this market because our students are learning how to do live shots. And there isn't a week or a weekend where, you know, you don't have a student who just loses their place or the information doesn't come across the way they thought it would when they were practicing it, and they just stop. You know, and that's one of the drawbacks of going live. But if you don't go live,
you're never going to get good at going live.
You're never going to get good at going live, and that's what the public expects you to be live and at the scene, because that's what we've given them over the course of, ever since live television came into being, they expect you to go live. And if you're not and somebody else is, they're the ones who are going to get the audience.
Yes. That only happened to me once, and I learned from that one mistake, though. So
let's get it together from there. Let's go back to what happened on The View, though, for a second. You were talking about the vice president being in another room. Took him some time to pull it together. On Monday's show, they spent more time talking about it, and Anna Navarro and Sonny Austin talked about the real-life implications this had for them, given, too, that they ultimately were false positives, which is a good thing. But, you know, Sonny Austin's husband is a doctor who was in surgery, had to be pulled out. There were so many just, you know, things that rolled downhill here. And on top of all of that, in that effort to get live TV going and figure out what to do in the moment, really private medical information was shared nationwide live on TV. It was a pretty big invasion of their privacy, too.
Yeah, exactly. And meaning even for the other two hosts, because they were out there, too, around them. So they could have been affected by them as well, because I'm sure they had some interaction with them. So actually, the whole show could have been affected by the whole
they could
process.
have to bring in 4 guest hosts for the next show or do a rerun or something of that nature. I mean, but what it does do is it demonstrates that we're still in the pandemic.
Yes.
We're still dealing with COVID, even though we have vaccines out there. There's still issues. You have the variants, you have vaccine hesitancy, you have the whole controversy over mask mandates, and every part of our life is in one way or another impacted by COVID. And even this demonstrates that.
Exactly.
And will continue to be an issue.
Yes.
So, fun fact about me that the two of you may or may not know, but in the past couple of years, I have become a voracious reader. And in my spare time, it's not uncommon for me to plow through a book or two every weekend. So I saw something about this being Banned Books Week and went to look at the list of the most often challenged books here in 2021. The ones on it most often this year are challenged for scenes of sexual assault, profanity, and sexual content. Some of them are new and contemporary, such as Stamped and The Hate U Give. Others have been there for decades, like To Kill a Mockingbird, Of Mice and Men, and The Bluest Eye. Some of your reactions to what showed up on that list this year?
One of the things that sort of jumped out at me was, Stamped being on there. I mean, we're talking about the history of this country, and and that's from a historical perspective that is based in fact and is true. And then you have To Kill a Mockingbird, which in many ways is fiction and does pretty much the same thing, and it's still on the list. So, I mean, is it that we are concerned about the images that are in those books, or are we concerned about the topics? And I would say that for To Kill a Mockingbird and for Stamp, to me it just comes across as the topic is more of an issue than the actual images that are depicted in those books.
I'd agree, because I'm really surprised that To Kill a Mockingbird is still on that list. Because, I mean, as a fiction, even though it's fiction, it's still a good read, and I still like the book. I mean, I think it has a good story that it tells. I think there's a lot that we can learn from that book, so I'm not sure why it's still on the list.
The Hate U Give was on the list from the Banned Books Week website. It was the only one that was listed specifically for anti-police imagery and anti-police messaging. That kind of stood out to me as well.
I mean, again,
Yeah.
the topic.
Yep.
And that's one of the things that bothers me about this list and other lists like it, is that quite often it's the topic of someone's belief or feeling that the topic itself is doesn't warrant it being published.
That's the other part. As I was looking at this list of profanity or political messaging.
Yeah.
Yep.
In so many ways, as I looked at these titles, I kept thinking that's really coded language for this is about civil rights, and this is about really bringing to the forefront what is going on in Black and brown communities, and we don't want our children to learn about
these
that.
books are challenging the dominant culture. It's challenging the common narrative, and that's part
But we're
of
going to say it's profanity.
But we're going to say it's this, and
We're going to say it's sexual
right,
content.
Right. Which is why To Kill a Mockingbird still being on the list, I have a problem with that, because I mean, we know what this is, and it's going to be talked about whether you ban a book or not. Banning a book generally will drive up the sales of said book.
True.
So,
Exactly.
Any banned books from your past that are among the favorites you've read in time?
I mean, I've read Stamped.
And I read, frankly, the adaptation that's on this list that was written for a teenage audience.
Yeah.
It's a great book.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's the one that sort of stood out to me that I've read lately.
I haven't read any of the current ones.
Yeah.
Of Mice and Men and To Kill a Mockingbird are the two that I've read.
And what about in the past not on this list? Books that you know that you've read, that you've really enjoyed, that you know have been challenged. I know for me, Judy Blume books, almost every one of those at some point was challenged. And Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, and Deanie. And
I can't think of one that I've read lately. So,
Okay. Well, that music means we are pretty much out of time for today. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. I'd like to thank the two of you for helping get through this last half hour with me. Thank RJI's Travis McMillan for running directing our show today. Aaron Hay for running our audio, doing his best to make us sound good. And to Tim Pilcher for composing our original theme music. I'm Amy Simons. We'll be with you again next week for another edition of Views of the News.